for morning hour speeches. Business starts at 2 p.m. A reminder, you can see live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2, the House on our companion network, C-SPAN. Now a look at the career of Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry. Janetta Rose Barris discusses her book, The Last of the Black Emperors, the hollow comeback of Marion Barry in the new age of black leaders. Ms. Barris is a columnist for the Washington Times and a contributor to several magazines.
Janetta Rose Barris, you're the author of a new book titled The Last of the Black Emperors, the hollow comeback of Marion Barry in the new age of black leaders. When you sat down to write and research this book, what kind of reader did you have in mind?
I actually had a general reader in mind, one who doesn't necessarily follow politics, maybe someone who would look at news articles and read them. And so I was more interested in contextualizing Marion Barry, sort of comparing him to other political figures, African-American political figures and mainstream American political figures, so that the average reader would see him connected to something, connected to a cultural tradition, and connected to an American political tradition, because I think a lot of people have looked at Marion Barry as unique, sort of an appendage of the political process, when he is actually, I think, an integral part of it and represents what American politics has become.
Where did Marion Barry grow up?
In Itta Bena, in Itta Bena, Mississippi, a small southern town. Actually, it's a little bit outside Itta Bena, on a plantation. His parents were sharecroppers and picked cotton, and they were very, very poor. His mother was 18 when she gave birth to Marion Barry, and his father was 46. So there was a huge age difference between them. Sort of, I think, though, that it was in keeping with the times. Often young women married older men, believing it was more stable, but they had a pretty rough life.
What was his formal education?
Well, now, he went to school, and his mother moved the family to Memphis. They went from Itta Bena to Arkansas for a little while, and then they went to Memphis. And so he went to school in Memphis, and then he went to Lemoyne College. Then he went to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and where he was working on a master's degree in chemistry, was getting a doctorate, was just a little shy of a doctorate. He did get his master's.
What year was he working on his doctorate?
I was in the 1960s, 67, I'm sorry, in the early 60s, around 57, 60, somewhere around that time, because he came up here to Washington in 1965.
Was it unusual for a young black man at the time to be progressing towards a doctorate?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there were quite a few blacks who had gotten doctorates before. That education was, for many blacks, perceived as the thing for advancing in American society. I mean, you had somebody like W.B. Du Bois, who had a doctorate, and Anna Cooper, who had a doctorate. So there were a number of well-known African Americans who had doctorates. I think it might have been strange to have someone of Marion Barry's caliber going, you know, it was a hard decision for him. Do I pursue education? Do I pursue the civil rights movement? But it was not unusual for African Americans to really struggle to go as high as they could with their college educations.
You mentioned in your book that he taught for a while. Where did he teach, and when did he stop teaching?
Well, now he taught in Louisville for a while, and left there, and it was only for one semester. He was a student teacher, and decided to come back to work in the movement, and went down to Mississippi. For a while, the movement was like his summer, what he would do on his summer vacation, and so he went to work on his doctorate and do student teaching at the same time, and then just decided to abandon all that and just focus on the civil rights movement.
What is the SNCC, and what was Marion Barry's involvement in that group?
It's pronounced SNCC, and it's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it was a sort of the youth arm of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, that conference that was started with a number of ministers in the South just after the boycott, well, just after Rosa Parks actually refused to give up her seat on the bus in Alabama. And a woman named Ella Baker thought it would be very important to involve youth. And so she called a bunch of young people who were involved in civil rights activities. Marion Barry was in Nashville at Fisk with Diane Nash and a number of other people, and John Lewis, who is now in Congress. And they were actually beginning to do some things of their own. So they were called, all of them went to North Carolina, and out of that meeting came the became SNCC. And for, I would imagine, for the 1960s, most of the 1960s, SNCC was pretty active. Toward the end of the 60s, early 70s, it began to just wane. People started, it started having its own internal strife.
From the South, how did Marion Barry come to Washington, and why?
Well, now, he was very involved in voter registration down in Mississippi, and decided, and they also sent him to do fundraising in the North for the organization. He was obviously pretty good at raising money. And so James Foreman, who was the secretary, a field secretary for SNCC at the time, decided that Washington, D.C. was sort of ripe for organizing. And Marion Barry was actually sent to Washington to help organize a chapter of SNCC and you know, sort of stimulate some activity. He got here, got involved, actually organized the first bus boycott. It was a one-day boycott. Because
in Washington?
In Washington, D.C. in 1965. It was a guy named O'Roy Chark who owned the bus company at that time. Many of the bus companies across the country were privately owned. And so Marion Barry came. There was some struggle to, the bus company wanted to raise the fare. People were, of course, opposed to that. They were also, they didn't necessarily like the way they were treated by the company and the number of bus routes they had and all of that. And so there was a boycott that was organized for one day. It was pretty successful. And they held back the nickel increase, but the guy eventually got his nickel. But Marion Barry obviously built his career on that particular successful action.
When was he first elected mayor of Washington, D.C.?
He was elected as the second mayor. The first mayor was Walter Washington, and Marion Barry was elected in 1978 as the second mayor of Washington, D.C., and remained mayor until 1990 when Sharon Pratt Kelly was elected. And then he, of course, reappeared in 1994 as the fourth, well, he was a sort of, it's hard to say whether he was the fourth mayor, but he sort of came back and succeeded Sharon Pratt Kelly.
In your book, you write about the 1994 election. What are some of the details? How did Marion Barry get elected in 1994? What was different about that election?
I don't think there was anything really different about that election. I think probably the thing that was different was that he had been arrested in 1990 by the FBI in an FBI sting at the Vista Hotel, where he was caught with a woman who was not his wife in a hotel room, who and he was smoking, or had just put a crack pipe to his mouth. And so no one thought, after such an international fall from grace, that he could possibly return to political office. But he used some of the same strategy. And there was an animosity in Washington, D.C. about the way that FBI sting actually occurred. A lot of people called it a setup. One of the things people were angry over was that here was Marion Barry in a room. He had gone to see a woman, principally, ostensibly, to have sex. And she actually kept suggesting to him drugs, and he kept saying no, and she kept suggesting. And so people got the general impression that he might not have smoked that crack pipe if she hadn't pushed him into it as a sort of a prelude to some romantic involvement. And it was that animosity then that he worked to his advantage. The other thing he worked to his advantage was that there was this real epidemic in all urban centers in America, certainly in Washington, D.C., with crack cocaine. Middle-class people, rich people were seeing their kids, some members of their family, cousins, uncles, sometimes husbands and wives, sort of falling to this particular drug, which was one of the most insidious drugs that had hit the American market of late. And so there was some understanding of what Marion Barry may have gone through, and that but for the grace of God, it could have been any one of them, or in some instances, it was one of them. And so they were particularly, I think, sympathetic to his struggle with drugs, and very angry. And so you had that combination of anger and sympathy sort of rolling into one, working with a very seasoned politician who understood the psychology of the city that he had led for almost 12, 16 years.
What role did the press have in covering Marion Barry from the beginning of his mayoral career and during this whole trial about the drug situation?
Oh, well, I think that in the beginning, Marion Barry was seen in Washington as a savior. The city was just coming into a kind of quasi-independence. It had been attached to Congress, sort of working as an agency of Congress, of the federal government. And the Congress under Richard Nixon had finally awarded the city what they call home rule, and limited home rule. And so he was seen as someone who could actually help structure a government. He came in with a cross-section of people, gays, whites, blacks, youngs, old, and so he had a very good coalition. The Washington Post, which was a major newspaper at that time, endorsed Marion Barry, and it was the Washington Post endorsement that actually kicked him up and had him win against Walter Washington and Sterling Tucker. And the Washington Post, up until almost up until about the middle of his third term as mayor, the Washington Post pretty much supported him. But like the rest of the city, they became very disillusioned when there were repeated rumors of his drug use, his womanizing. He was caught. And so the Post, I think, in this case with Marion Barry, the Post and the other Washington media, the Washington Times and black media, build him up. And yet, and I would have to say that they played a strong role in his decline.
In your book, you write about the Washington Post, and I wanted to read one of the sentences that you wrote about the 1994 coverage. Mm-hmm. The Washington Post went after Barry with a vengeance, covering his campaign like white on rice. Wherever he went, reporters were there, and what the news pages missed, the editorial pages picked up on. It was an awesome assault that only an omnipotent institution like the Post could mount. What did you mean by that sentence?
Well, I think that they were all over him. It was like a Michael Jordan kind of thing. In that the Washington Post has the luxury of having as many as 25 reporters they can assign to cover one story in a minute. And so you have to remember that they had endorsed Sharon Pratt Kelly, Marion Barry's predecessor, or the incumbent in that race. They had endorsed this woman in 3 different endorsements on the editorial page. She was their candidate to actually clean up the city. Now, she performed very poorly, but they also did not want Marion Barry to return. And so the Washington Post staff then went after finding the facts and finding out whether Marion Barry was actually redeemed. Was he using drugs? What was he doing in his personal life that could affect his professional career and his professional life? And the editorial pages, the columnists and the editorial page itself, were critically looking at what he could offer. A lot of people in the city, and I think the media could be accused of this as well, were concerned about what would a return of Marion Barry do to the city's relationship with Congress, which was already kind of frayed from his previous tenure and did not get much better under Sharon Pratt Kelly.
I wanted to mention a couple names and just have you describe for us Marion Barry's relationship with these people. One name is Reverend Jesse Jackson. Are they friends? Are they foes? What's their relationship?
I think that at one point that they were friends. One in 1994, well, in 1990, where there was talk of Jesse Jackson running against Marion Barry, Marion Barry made the comment that the only thing Jesse's going to do is run his mouth. The only way, so there is that kind of competitive relationship that they have. They both were in the movement together, but clearly Jesse Jackson was much closer to the Reverend Martin Luther King than Marion Barry. At this point, I think that there is a healthy but distant respect for each other.
How about Andrew Brimmer? Who is Andrew Brimmer, and what's their relationship?
Andrew Brimmer is the director of the DC Financial Responsibility and Management Assistance Authority, commonly called the Control Board here, which was created by Congress created by Congress in March 1995 to actually help the city to work its way out of the financial crisis, much like a control board was created for New York and a control board created for Philadelphia when those cities faced the brink of insolvency and financial and management crises. And so Andrew Brimmer is the chairman of that board. Now, what's interesting about Andrew Brimmer and Marion Barry is they are probably very from the same era, in that, and from the same region, and similar experiences. Andrew Brimmer grew up in Louisiana in a sharecropper kind of experience as well, and worked his way all the way up to become a member of the federal board, an economist, and very highly respected international credentials. Marion Barry from Mississippi grows up to become a rebel rouser, community organizer, and politician. In the tradition of the South, Andrew Brimmer would probably be respected far more simply because of his educational credentials, but also because of his sense of dignified presence that he presents, which African Americans still sort of admire. There's this cool reserve that I speak about in the book, that you never, ever let anyone else understand that they have ruffled your feathers. And I think Andrew Brimmer is sort of the same coin. Marion Barry and Andrew Brimmer are the same coin, just different sides of it.
How many times has Marion Barry been married? And tell us about his wives. Who's he married to now?
He's married to Cora Masters. He married her just as he was coming into office, right after leaving a federal penitentiary for the conviction of drug possession. He married her in 1993. He became a Ward 8 council member, city council member, the same year. And she was someone who had supported him for a very long time, back in the 80s, and was a friend of the family, is how my sources tell me, and developed a relationship with him while he was still married.
Was she the one on the boxing commission?
Yes,
what was
she was the chairman of the boxing commission for a while, and this was back in the early 1980s, and there was a bit of a problem with her tenure where she was accused of double dipping, charging the city for expenses and charging the Federal Boxing Commission for, the Federation of Boxing Commission for the same expenses. She pleaded guilty to avoid actual jail time and prosecution, and repaid the money. And so she obviously was taken off the boxing commission. But she and the mayor remained very good friends, and he made sure she had access to that. And she still remains pretty active in that industry. Prior to her was Effie Cowell, who was a teacher, economics teacher at one time, in health and economics teacher in New York, came to Washington, met Marion Barry while he was still married to his second wife. Marion Barry began an affair with her. He eventually began living with her, and just before he decided to run for mayor, he and Effie were married. They had a child, Christopher, who is on his way to college. This year will be his last year, and he'll be attending Hampton University, is what his dad says. Effie Cowell and Marion Barry were divorced just after the end of the trial, the drug possession trial.
And she was the third wife?
She was actually, yes, his third wife.
Okay.
Now, the second wife was Mary Treadwell, whom he met while he was in the South, but did not become socially or connected to until he came up here to Washington, D.C. She was already here in Washington. She was very active and involved with him in community activities. They co-founded, along with Carol Harvey and Catfish Mayfield, an organization called Pride, Youth Pride, Inc., which was pretty innovative at the time that they did this back in the 70s. It was the late 60s, early 70s when the organization was at its height. And it was designed to take what some of us might call street dudes or thugs off the street, give them real skills, help them create businesses, which they did, and it was very successful for a time. Now,
and who was the first wife?
The first wife was Blanty Evans, whom he met while he was in college and divorced shortly thereafter. She divorced him, actually accused him of desertion, principally because he was actually married to the revolution, as some people might say, because he spent most of his time in the civil rights movement, didn't have time for a wife, and probably realized when he did it that it was a big mistake.
Did you attend his 1995 inaugural that you described where Maya Angelou read poetry? Tell us what happened there.
It was at the D.C. University of the District of Columbia in their gymnasium. A very this exuberance was just, like something phenomenal had happened, and so everybody was very excited. Marion Barry, Maya Angelou read this poem by Sterling Brown, Strong Men, which actually sort of charts the life of African Americans in this country from slavery, their struggle through Jim Crow, and their amazing resilience. And reading that poem, she then connected Marion Barry's life and recent struggle and rise again with that kind of philosophy, which really gave him, I think, much more currency and credentials than he probably deserved. But nonetheless, it was an exciting moment. It was a very emotional moment for him, for his wife, for his son, to see that a man who had fallen so low was now picked up and placed on the shoulders of this city, much the way football players would do a winning coach. And it was an amazing show of forgiveness from a community, I thought.
In your book, your subtitle is The Hollow Comeback of Marion Barry. Do you view his comeback as hollow? And tell us more about your subtitle.
Well, the book actually looks at not only his rise from the prison, the federal prison, and what happened to get him back into political office in city council and then the mayoral seat, but it looks at the substance of that rise, and that's where the hollow comeback comes from. The substance of what he did in 1992 as a city council member representing one of the city's more underserved and poor populations, he actually, in my view and from the facts, did very little for those people during the 1 year that he was actually representing them. He basically used them as pawns and a stepping stone to his struggle to get back his mayor's seat. As mayor, just coming in, realizing that he's facing about a $700 million cumulative deficit, projected deficit, put the sort of the cap on his ability to rise any higher than just being reelected, because it put into work the creation of a control board and then the removal of power that subsequently went along with that. And so while he may have thought that coming into office would give him the opportunity to reshape his legacy and reposition himself as a major power in African American political history, in fact, what it did was to make him completely impotent.
For the book, did you interview him?
No, he refused to participate in the book.
Why?
Well, now, I don't know why. He said, well, I don't know what you're going to write. Well, you never know what a reporter or a journalist or a writer is going to write. But I think he also is planning to write his own book. I think he understood that I was coming to this story with a wealth of information. I've been covering the city since 1984.
For what paper?
For the Washington Afro-American, and then later the Washington Times, and then later Washington City paper. And so I fairly know Marion Barry and Marion Barry-isms and Barry speaks, and you know, and all these little kind of techniques, political techniques that politicians use and become attached to them.
Are you a conservative?
No, I'm not. I consider myself an independent. And I think I have Marion Barry to thank for that, because I at one time in 1982 actually went to work for his campaign as assistant to his to the press person, the press secretary for his second term, and grew disillusioned with the organization of that campaign, although he did win. And later I worked for a time in the district government as a consultant, and it was seeing various things up close that I was able to realize that I could not just attach my endorsement and support to a politician simply because he was black. And I think that a number of African Americans throughout this country have done that. And so the book, which talks about the new age of black leaders, goes right to that. The broader theme of the book is to sort of assess what we as African Americans must do if we are going to really be politically empowered in this country. And part of it is to objectively evaluate our leaders, not just to stand behind them and support everything they do simply because they're black. And so my independence then comes from my understanding that everything black is not always gold.
I have two final questions. 20, 30 years from now, when people look back at the history of Washington, D.C. and Marion Barry, what will his legacy be?
I think the main thing that people will remember about Marion Barry is that he helped in a very dramatic way to expand the middle class here, and also to expand the middle class in PG County. Prince George's County, which is adjacent to Washington, D.C. as a suburb, is now one of the more wealthy and better educated suburbs in the country, and predominantly black. And many of those people lived in Washington, worked for Marion Barry, worked for the district government. Marion Barry did a great deal to help to create that middle class.
Is he going to run again in 1998? And if he does, would you vote for him?
I don't expect him to run again in 1998. I think that Marion Barry understands that with the control board, he will have no power until the year 2002, and Congress may be inclined to strip him of the last few little agencies that he currently has power over. So I expect him to go out quietly and to sort of repackage himself and to say, these are all the things that I've done, and I think I've done a good job.
Janetta Rose Barris, we thank you for coming into C-SPAN to talk to us about The Last of the Black Emperors, the hollow comeback of Marion Barry in the New Age of Black Leaders, published by Bancroft Press. Thank you.
Thank you.